Really an honor to be here. When Jim called me back in August, I ordered the book and really enjoyed it. Like Jim said, I'm a history major, so we're going to kind of walk through it. But why don't we back up just recently, being in Nashville, maybe the dichotomy of Nashville, Chicago, the kind of the whole history, maybe. Kind of the theme through the book is Chicago maybe missed the boat when it comes to country music.
Well, early on it did,
Okay.
or early on, yeah, it did. It did a couple decades into it, and then there was this relationship that's continued to this day. My book it covers about 100 years of history, and I spent about 10 years writing it. So it's a really deep dive, a lot of deep research, and interviewed a lot of people. A lot of people who I since have interviewed are no longer with us, including John Prine, who was going to write the foreword to the book. He agreed a year before he died. The Nashville thing, the book starts in 1924. In April 1924 when WLS went on the air, and that's right when radio was the new technology and people were running out to buy a radio, and if they couldn't buy a radio, they made a radio, and that's how fast it was kind of adapting. But back then, country music wasn't called country music, it was called folk music. It was really songs that came from people's living rooms and front porches, and people collected them. And the industry that we know as the country music industry in Nashville didn't really start until like the 50s. That's when Nashville became a prominent town, when all the studios came in, all the labels came in, Music Row became something, the publishing. But the years before that, Chicago was really the dominant city. It's the largest city in the center part of the country. And the history that we've all been told about country music, it's a southern thing, it's this linear thing that comes through Nashville. But what the Barn Dance kind of showed was it was a Saturday night radio show that preceded the Grand Ole Opry, and it later became a national show, coast to coast. That country music was really a rural thing, not a southern thing, because farms in Wisconsin and farms in Tennessee are dealing with the same issues. They're interested in the same entertainment. And the Barn Dance really was the first vehicle to mass market the music, to send it to people's homes. And they did an incredible job in that. And that blueprint is still followed today.
And so that was Saturday night.
Saturday Night Barn Dance.
WLS, world's largest store,
Right.
owned by Sears.
Well, owned by Sears for a couple of years, and
Then
it
purchased.
Was, yeah, and then it was purchased by a magazine called Prairie Farmer.
Okay.
That was it was a magazine for farmers, and so it was a natural fit. And the reason why, like Nashville, as the music as anything progresses over time, it advances over time, it gets more modern as time goes on. And that was definitely the case with country music. Then at a certain point, drums were added, different themes. It was becoming modernized in the honky-tonk era of Hank Williams and Lefty Frizzell and Kitty Wells, and the Barn Dance didn't really want to have anything to do with that. The people who ran were very conservative, and so they went in a different direction. But the modern sounds of country music then really kind of found a home in Nashville, and then after that, that's when Nashville really took off, and that's when the industry became really an industry.
So Saturday night, there was actually live musicians playing on the radio. These were not recordings.
Right. Yeah. It was a live musicians. They
Studio.
Had,
right.
Yeah. They had singers. They even had dancers. They had square dancers on the radio. They put down special boards so people could dance, and so you're in your living room, you hear the dancing, and it's the theater of the mind. But the whole point of the Barn Dance, and that the dancing thing kind of shows it, and also the first dancers, the square dancers, were included in that group were Bill Monroe and Charlie Monroe. They lived in Indiana. They worked at Sinclair Oil and Whiting, and they were square dancers themselves. So a talent scout saw them in Hammond dancing one Saturday night and invited them to join the show. and but they joined not as bluegrass players because it hadn't been invented yet. They joined as dancers. But my point is that the barn dance really kind of took this music that came from pretty hard places, people living hard lives, and it made it entertainment. They recruited performers from Appalachia to come up. Some Southerners were already in Chicago and wanted to get into showbiz, and they brought them on. And and a lot of the times the performers were given new names, they were given new identities, they were put into costumes. And it was really like this, putting a mirror up to the rest of America of what the music, what the music should look like. In a way, you might say a sanitized version. I like to think of it as sort of like this kind of a glossier version of where the music really came from. And it really was kind of a mass. They had a magazine, they had a talent bureau, they would put people on the road. They had merch like you would find at a store today or at a show today. And it was really the first big engine of like taking the music from all these small towns and then turning around and then giving the music back to these small towns in a way that was really highly enjoyable.
Through radio,
but also through the touring, through the merchandising, through the records. There was Hollywood. There were a couple of films made. So it was the first million-selling record. Country Stars came from the barn dance. So it was really a vehicle to show that this music had, the rest of America really enjoyed this music when it was kind of put on this, when it was sort of, it was made to kind of stand up in a way, and discover an audience.
Versus jazz or blues or any of that.
In a way, it was kind of a reaction to jazz.
Okay.
I think jazz was considered kind of scary music. It was really, hot jazz. It was played in nightclubs. People were drinking. This music was kind of much more kind of sanitized in a way. But out of it came all these incredible singers, but also these great stories of people who kind of came from really nothing, and their lives were completely turned around, and they became something. They became somebody else. Right. And that's a great story about. That story is kind of continuing today.
I almost thought it like music. The American Idol or America's Got Talent, right? That type of thing. So,
right.
You brought up a couple personalities, and early on, this John Dewey Hay, who I guess started at WLS and then moved to Nashville, and the Opry started then a few years later.
Yeah,
off of the barn dance.
Right. So he was on the on the radio in Memphis, and he was very popular there. So they brought him as the announcer, and he would blow this train whistle and announce at the beginning of the show and announce that the train has arrived in Chicago and the barn dance is going to start. Amazingly enough, even in 1924, there were industry awards for radio, and he was so popular, he won all these national awards. The industry was really taking a look at what he was doing in Chicago. So WSM in Nashville hired him, and he moved down to Nashville, and they said, well, do whatever you were doing up there and do it for us. And so he started the Grand Ole Opry. And he's on record saying that he basically started it. Basically, he was going to repeat everything he did in Chicago. And again, WSM was not the powerhouse that WLS later became. And so for about, it was really after World War II that WSM really, really took off. And
the Opry too.
And, the Opry, for sure.
Right, okay. Then we kind of move through, I guess, going to like second chapter or third chapter, the personalities, I guess, Gene Autry, some of the barn dance, but Hillbilly Heaven, the movement to Uptown. So those that are familiar with Uptown, why don't you work on it?
Sure, yeah. So there's a chapter that looks at, and Uptown and also Highwood too, because Highwood had a big, because of the Court Sheridan, it had a big
hillbilly
night
population.
Scene. Yeah, and but so a lot of people. It's funny. I've been doing these events, and people don't realize that the north side of Chicago was heavily Southern. There was a second migration to Chicago, and that was white Southerners, really from the upland part of the South, moving here because of jobs. Agricultural jobs were plummeting. There was no future. That was an old way of life, and so they were coming up here for low-skill labor jobs at factories. And they Uptown itself was a neighborhood built for the Roaring '20s of the days of Al Capone. It was sort of it was a playground for the wealthy, so that's why you had the Green Mill and the Aragon Ballroom and several other theaters and these beautiful opulent apartment buildings that were built along the lake. But after the crash, it all fell, and it fell into blight. And so slumlords took over the buildings, they cut up all the apartments into smaller apartments, and this population of Southerners moved in, and it built and it overpopulated that neighborhood. But kind of what they brought with them was also their music too. And so you had all these bars that had music in them. They were kind of storefront honky tonks. In the book I met, he's since died, a guitarist who played at a bunch of those clubs, and he opened up a music store that became sort of central to the Southerners who were living there. He would have a radio show on Saturday. He sold Western suits. He sold songbooks. And when touring musicians would come through town, that's where they would go and hang out. And so it was really the center of Southern culture, but right in the north side of Chicago.
During the Depression, right after 30s, early
decades,
40s.
All the way up through the 50s, 60s, and 70s.
Okay.
Yeah, so it was a slow migration, and at the tail end, with the first Daley administration, really was pursuing urban renewal. They saw the north side as an opportunity to gentrify the city, and so that's when there was all this tension, more or less, between the city, the Chicago Police Department, and the people who live. They wanted them out, and
basically,
and they wanted them out. So there was all this push to get those people out. What's amazing is part of the story is that there was actually resistance back. And this was in the 60s when there was obviously a lot of activism and civil rights going on. But what was interesting about what was going on in Uptown is that you had the activism back where street gangs turned into social justice organizations. And so you had a white street gang, you had a Puerto Rican street gang, and you had the Black Panthers. And they all got together in a room like this and said, we're going to do something about this. And they did. And so it's kind of an incredible story, and they were called the Rainbow Coalition, which was where that name comes from.
Well, and speaking of that, so hillbilly music, we went from folk music for this country to hillbilly music, more or less. And so when did the country music term really come in?
Well, it was kind of later, yeah. So
Okay.
it was just called folk music. If you look at a lot of early recordings, it would be like Man with Guitar or something like that. They didn't even know really what to call it. Everything was called folk music back then, which was kind of funny. I mean, ethnic music from actual other countries was called folk music. You had ethnic folk music, you had white folk music, you had southern folk music.
It's played by folks.
That's right, exactly. And but it was once in the introduction of my book, I talk about how it kind of developed. It got that name, but then folk music kind of became this other thing in the 50s through the folk revival, and what that really was white middle class people in the suburbs, in the city, who were discovering all those recordings I just described that were made in the 1920s and 30s. By the 50s, they were all being reissued by places like the Smithsonian. Okay. People had never heard this music before. And if you think about it, in the 50s, rock and roll was coming, Elvis, all these things, like there was a big shift, and a lot of what people were interested in reaction to that were these country blues performers who had recorded decades earlier, and oddly enough were still alive. And so there was a lot of people from Chicago who would travel down. And in the book, there's a book dedicated to the University of Chicago Folk Festival, which started in 1961. And those were University of Chicago students, 18, 19, 20-year-olds, getting in their car, driving down to the South, knocking on the doors of people and saying, I always think of it like a Martian landed, in the Mississippi Delta. I'm from the University of Chicago. Could you come up to Chicago in February and play in Chicago? And a lot of these performers had never been to Chicago. They'd never played before. Some of them had never played before white audiences. They'd never been to a city. And so those couple years are kind of a magical time that we'll never have again, where you have these students sort of communicating with people who are much older than them from completely different backgrounds. You have people like Elizabeth Cotton, the Stanley Brothers, Mississippi John Hurt, all Mabel Carter, all these people who are very well known today, but kind of brought up and to play that festival. And that festival is still going on. It's the same form today, every February down there.
And the book is University of Chicago Press.
Yeah, the book is on the University of Chicago Press. And the other thing is that at the same time that was going on, in 57, the folk revival's going on. So all these people are coming up and they're playing college campuses like the University of Chicago. They're playing places like Orchestra Hall. But there's never been a nightclub dedicated to music where people could go on a date and go to a nightclub where they're serving alcohol. There were jazz clubs and there were
coffee shops.
Yeah,
right.
But there was never like a serious nightclub. And the Gate of Horn in the Rush Street area opened up, and that was opened up by a Chicagoan named Albert Grossman, who very soon after that would form Peter, Paul, and Mary. He was the famous manager of Bob Dylan. He was really instrumental in rock history for becoming one of the first kind of mega managers. But at that point, he saw money in folk music, and so he started this nightclub that was nationally recognized. New York didn't have one. New York just had coffee shops on Bleecker Street in Greenwich Village. And so you had all these performers coming to Chicago to audition for him to hopefully make it big. And the list of people who went through the Gate of Horn, it's a who's who of that time period.
And from there, Old Town School, kind of the book progresses, Gate of Horn into Old Town School.
Yeah, because at the Gate of Horn, so the Old Town School of Folk Music, which we all know is still running today.
58?
That was, I think the Gate of Horn was 56 and the Old Town School opened in 57.
Okay.
And so the three founders of the Old Town School of Folk Music met at the Gate of Horn. Because really, if you were into that music, there was really nowhere else to go. I think it's another kind of incredible story where you had three people from three completely different backgrounds, and the only thing that connected to them was the music. One was a homemaker in Oak Park. I describe her sort of today's kind of a super fan, somebody who might have a house concert. She was just a fan. She went to the Gate of Horn all the time because she loved the music, and so did her husband. The second one was Frank Hamilton, who was a 20-year-old guitarist from the West Coast. He had learned from Woody Guthrie. He had traveled all around like one of those 20-year-olds I was describing, learning from people in small towns, and he was hired as the house guitarist. And the third person was someone who was kind of an unsung hero of Chicago called Win Strachey. And at that point, Win Strachey was probably in his 50s. He had lived this incredible life as a singer. He was on early Chicago television. He was best friends with Studs Terkel. And he came out of the labor movement. So folk music to him was about the labor movement, going around singing labor songs at union halls, and he was a recording artist too. But he was under surveillance by the FBI because of that past, as was Studs Terkel.
McCarthy movement type thing.
Yep, the FBI was, and the only reason we know that is because I did a Freedom of Information Act to the FBI in writing this book. Even his family didn't know that. And so his FBI reads like a novel, like a pulp novel. They harassed him, so he lost all of his jobs. And so he was at the Gate of Horn. This was kind of his last thing. You could rent him out to play your wedding or something like that. And they all met. So they met at the Gate of Horn. He said his dream was to have a school, and he said he said to Frank Hamilton, you could teach it, and we can have it in your living room in Oak Park, to Dawn Green. And so it started in her living room. And the reason it ended up in Old Town, because he lived in Old Town, and so he found a space in Old Town about 3 blocks away from his house, and then classes started a few months later there.
And the idea was group as opposed to a one-on-one type of student.
Yeah, what made that really kind of
unique, I guess.
Really unique was that at that point, if I wanted to learn guitar, it was a conservatory method. I would find a master guitarist, and I might sit in a room with them, and we would look at each other in the eye, and he would teach me. The Old Town School, because it came really from these very ideals of folk music, and also really from the labor movement, they thought that the music could actually make the world a better place. And it could do that if we could all get into a room together, and we can all, it's not about technique, it's about the songs. And if we sing songs together and we look each other into the eye, we will we'll see each other's humanity. And it's a beautiful concept. And the Old Town School taught people in groups, and it encouraged people, if you don't have any skills whatsoever, don't worry, just come in here, because we're not about, being hot on your instrument. We're about just finding out what connects us and playing together, something we just don't. We're so isolated by modern society. And so that was the point of the Old Town School, and they still practice that technique today.
And that is unique to Chicago.
It's completely unique. And when I was in Nashville last week, it was for this John Prine's family. It's the second year that they've been doing kind of a 3 or 4 day celebration of him on the week of his birth. And they have concerts, and they had this thing, and I was asked by his wife about why the Old Town School was even, why was that a special place for the John Prine. And his brother Dave Prine, who just died a couple weeks ago, took classes there. And Dave Prine was interested in he was an electrical engineer in Maywood, and he was really interested in music. Old time music, the music from the 20s. So he was one of those folk revival guys. The only place he could learn that music was the Old Town School of Folk Music. So he went there, and he took banjo lessons from a guy named Fleming Brown. And Fleming Brown was considered this master banjo player, and Fleming Brown had learned music from a guy named Doc Hopkins. And Doc Hopkins was a guy from the South who had come up here, and he had played on the barn dance. So you have these continuing, this sort of thread from the barn dance all the way up to the 60s, just through 2 people. And so Dave Prine learns banjo from Fleming Brown, ends up teaching his class, and then he teaches his younger brother, John Prine. And then John Prine goes to the Old Town School to start taking classes. And then the 70s happened, and the reason why folk music had pretty much died everywhere else because of rock and roll. Greenwich Village, that we've heard, there's 1,000,001 books written about the Greenwich Village folk scene. It didn't last that long. It was very, very brief. But in Chicago, folk music had this second coming in the 70s, and the reason really was because the Old Town School of Folk Music was there, and it was this foundation that people could go learn from, and it had never gone away. And so now, John Prine's coming out of it, and Steve Goodman, and all these other people, and they want to play music, and now there's the singer-songwriter scene in the 70s, so people start opening clubs where they can go on stages like this and play their songs, and they're playing songs to other songwriters. This whole songwriting community happens and develops throughout the 70s. That is completely unique to Chicago, and it's all kind of connected back to the Old Town School.
You interviewed John Prine, you said.
A few times, yeah.
Okay. And as nice a guy as he seems.
Absolutely. I feel like he was a true Chicago, as I'm sure everyone in the room here knows from seeing him. He's a true Chicago guy. He'd talk to anybody, and he had great stories. And so one of the stories that told Nash and the guy who was moderating this panel got from my book, and he told me, I think last time I interviewed him, was he would talk about his father, who was not from Kentucky. His father was born here too. His grandfather was born in Kentucky and moved here, and he moved up here as a laborer, like all those other Southerners. But we were talking about all the Southern bars on the north side, and he said his dad, who would take him to a Cubs game, and would before the Cubs game, he'd take him, like every father would, to a bar, and so
in Chicago.
And so they went to a bar down Clark Street, and it was one of those hillbilly bars, and he said to his son, he said, "I'm going to give you a tip. when you go out to a bar like this, always buy, even if you're by yourself, buy 2 beers, one to drink and the other to hit somebody over the head with if there's trouble that starts.
Just in case.
And I thought, it's great. The guy was like full of great stories like that. And actually, a side note is that, so years later after he told me that story, if you guys are familiar with Metro, the rock club right down the street from Wrigley Field, the owner of Metro bought the Gingerman Tap, which was right in the corner there on Clark and Racine or Roscoe, Racine or something like that. And now it's called G-Man Tavern, and it's a beautiful, great old corner Chicago bar. And he told me that, I told him that story sometime earlier this year, and he said, John, I came in here one time after I bought the bar, and it was a Saturday afternoon. I walked in, nobody was in here, but John Prine was standing in the middle of the bar looking around. And he said, so I introduced myself to him, and I welcomed him to the bar. And he said, my dad used to take me to this bar. And so I was thinking like that might be the bar that his dad took him to.
That could have been, right? So we moved from the 70s, and then the book kind of progresses into what you call insurgent country or alt country, I guess.
Yeah, it was called so many different things. So like as time moves on, like in the 80s and 90s, country music, modern country music had changed in a big way too, right? So it was becoming much more pop, the pop
Eagles
music.
And
sure. And so like everything, there's like a reaction to anything. And what was going on was that a lot of people playing in punk rock bands were discovering there was a lot of continuity between like blue collar punk rock bands and early country music. It was a lot of the same themes, and there was a lot of people with the same backgrounds. And so a lot of those artists or a lot of those bands just started playing that music. But the thing was that there really were no venues for people playing like what you would call alternative country. There were no country bars there. There were mainstream country bars, people going on and playing the hits that are on the radio, but there were no like places that were for original songwriters who were getting into it. Definitely not at the rock clubs at all. And so there was a scene in the late 80s where there were a lot of alternative spaces, so art galleries, performance art spaces where you'd have people from the School of the Art Institute doing their performance art, and then you'd have someone doing some songs from Appalachia following it. So it was this thing that was very, very different. At the exact same time, there was a band called the Sundowners that I'm sure a lot of people here remember, and that band was a trio that was playing in a bar in the Loop for 30 years. And by this time, this was pretty much nearing the end of their 30 years. And these were musicians who were incredible musicians. They knew 15,000 songs. They played 5 sets a night. And the word started getting out among the kind of younger 20-year-olds that there was a bar where you can go and hear these guys play hardcore country music where they couldn't find that anywhere else in Chicago. And so... again, like I think there's a theme in the book where like just people from opposite worlds kind of coming together over the music, and that's really what was going on then in the 80s, because a lot of these people went there to learn from those guys or sit in with them, and they really were kind of by the 90s when all this kind of alternative country stuff happened, they kind of were sort of a lot of those musicians really looked up to them because of, and they were generous too. Like musicians, I always find are really, really generous in one way, and so they were generous in teaching them too. They actually loved the fact that all these young kids were kind of all of a sudden going to see them, and so they had this relationship with a lot of those people, and a lot of those people then went to form a couple of record labels in Chicago, and one of them was Bloodshot Records, which was a record label that just existed to document this whole scene that I'm describing. And Bloodshot in the 90s really was about 10 years ahead of the curve of the Americana movement that we know that started happening in this century. And it all kind of goes back to the Sundowners.
Okay. And from the Chicago perspective or Illinois perspective, I know that Uncle Tupelo, Greg Cott did a book on Wilco. Those guys met with their love for more, like you said, punk, and that theme of that kind of hard-working, hardcore, and blended that. So can you
Yeah, I mean,
talk on Wilco a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, so one of the clubs that started, I think it was around 1994 or so. The date's in the book. That was a small little club that opened up. It was going to start. Actually, it also was a women-owned club. 3 women owned it. And then it became 2 women owned it.
Which one was this, Lounge Acts?
Lounge Acts.
Okay.
Yeah, and so they started booking all that stuff. It was an underground rock club, and they booked all these indie rock bands from the 80s and currently of that time. But they also started booking all of this music from Texas and other places that were coming up. There were no places for these bands to play because they weren't big enough. They weren't big enough to play Metro. They weren't commercial bands, and so they would play lounge acts. And so the scene started gathering in the 90s around lounge acts, and Uncle Tupelo played there. They were from Belleville, St. Louis area. And Jeff Tweedy, who was in Uncle Tupelo, ended up marrying one of the owners.
Oh, okay.
And that's where that scene... so when he formed Wilco, that became kind of their headquarters. That became their club, and they would do rehearsal shows there. But more importantly, even than Wilco, was that this, again, kind of like I was describing with the Gate of Horn and all these other places, it was kind of became this creative incubator. Musicians would go, even if they weren't playing, to go check out other musicians. People would go there on their off nights, and it became sort of the scene where people started collaborating with each other, and all of the kind of bands that kind of came out of that are considered sort of legacy players today. I mean, there's people like the Handsome Family, the Waco Brothers, Robbie Fulks, Wilco, Andrew Bird, Nico Case, a lot of those people. And so but it didn't last that long. It ended, I think by the year 2000 it had closed because, again, gentrification had made it had kind of the neighborhood had changed so much. But yeah, Lounge Acts was a really important place to kind of foster that whole scene.
So I don't know, for the sake of time, Jim. Okay, if you buy the book, we hope you all do. The back of the book has a couple appendix, and then just a massive amount of cliff notes. So the research you've done. But the appendix, what was that I did? Just the
appendix.
Chicago
yes, the appendix
songs.
Yeah, so country songs that mention or about Chicago, and then kind of an essential that I thought would be kind of like an album list. The thing is that what's kind of frustrating is that a lot of that stuff is out of print. Even the stuff that most of the stuff I write about, you have to go really search for it, or go to a used record store. And I think that kind of says something about. There's so much great music out here, but because things moved really fast, and record labels kind of came and went, and we were just talking about Flying Fish, which is this great record label in the 70s that did world music, bluegrass. They had incredible, like John Hartford was on that record label, and Sam Bush, and all this great bluegrass stuff, and that's that entire catalog's out of print. And so you think everything's available on Spotify. It is definitely not. So, that's my problem with streaming, is that it makes people get rid of their record collections and their turntables. You kind of need one to listen to a lot of this music.
Yeah. Well, thanks, Mark. It's been a pleasure.
Oh, thanks for having me.
Yeah.
Peter, thank you. I want to just take a couple more minutes. I got a couple of questions for you. If anybody has a question, raise your hand and just shout it out. Anybody?
We can't see you.
I can see you. All right. So I'm going to ask questions. Mark, thank you.
Oh, thanks.
Peter, thank you. So one of my favorite interviewers of all time was a guy named Brian Lamb. He had a show called Book Notes. I don't know if you remember that on C-SPAN. Any book geeks out there? And one of the questions that he asked a lot of writers, Mark, was, where do you write? What time of day? Do you have a desk? Do you have a room? Do you go to a coffee shop? Do you write longhand, typewriter? Dylan writes all his songs on a typewriter, I've heard. Prine too? Yeah.
Well, So for this book, I wrote it over 10 years, and I wasn't writing it straight. What I did was I wrote right. I knew that when I got in the middle, that I would get. When I started, I knew I had to get to the people who were going to die first, and so and that was like in the middle part of the book. I thought the people from the 50s, I need to get to them first, and so I did countless interviews for this book, and so I would go through a year of interviewing people, and then I was always working ahead. So if I was interviewing people, I'd be working on another chapter. And then I would use the interviews from the previous year for then the next year's chapter I'd be writing. And so I write for a living, too. I'm a journalist, so I'm writing every single day. But I wasn't necessarily writing the book. I found that it was what was best for me for this book was that I would go write on the weekends a lot, or I would go somewhere and go write for like a full week and get a lot done. So I'd write in these kind of marathon sprints. But a lot of the book wasn't, in fact, I always say like the writing's like the fun part. The research and the interviews, that was like the muscle part. Because I had to find people, endless emails, networking with people, sitting down with people, then I didn't hire a transcriber. I transcribed every single interview myself because I felt it was really important for me to listen again to the person talking. Because if I listen to them, I'm going to catch something they told me that I didn't remember when I sat down with them. And so I transcribed every single interview. So that was really the heavy lifting of this book was all the work before the writing. Yeah. Oh, what do you mean?
Yellow pad?
Oh, no, I was always at a computer. You can't. As those who will see when I sign their books will realize I have no. You can't understand anything that I actually write down.
Okay. Have you thought or given, you're in the midst of a serious book tour and working your butt off on this, which I so admire. I mean, I just admire the whole thing. Writing a book has got to be one of the most difficult things and challenging things, but beautiful things, Do you got your eye on anything next?
Oh, next? Yeah, I'm writing a book right now, but something completely different than this, and I really would like to finish it because I like to move on to other things. Actually, I want to write another music book or two, and I'm kind of in the stages of, but those two kind of involve, one of them involves kind of writing sort of an authorized biography of a really well-known band, and I'm right now the leader of that band is reading this book, deciding whether he can trust me with all of his terrible stories. So, and then the second one is a book that kind of expands on a figure in this book, because I found all this other material that I couldn't believe existed. So I might do something on one of the people in the book. Yeah.
Awesome. And it sounds like you can't say who that is, so I'm not going to ask you. But I got a pitch for you.
Oh yeah.
All right. So, and this is kidding.
Joke pitch.
I seriously have wanted to. I'm fascinated by. Do you know who Vanetta Fields, Shirley Matthews, and Clyde King are?
I do not.
So, those three women have been singing on countless Linda Ronstadt, Bob Dylan. I mean, I can't even go through the whole list, but I've kind of had this obsession with background singers. It's kind of like, what's that, 20 Feet from Stardom or whatever.
Yeah. Yep.
And I want to do a book on Vanetta Fields, Shirley Matthews, and Clyde King because they're on every damn song. You're going to go home today, listen to the radio, and you will hear their voice. I guarantee it. So maybe you can help me write that.
You should do it. You should expand it, too. There's two great backup singers who live in this area, actually, currently. You may not even know. One is Kelly Hogan, and she's the backup singer for Mavis Staples. And every time you see Mavis Staples, Kelly Hogan is right behind her doing all this backup song.
Wow. Where does she live?
She lives right across the border in Wisconsin.
Oh.
Yeah. In Albany, I think. I don't know if she wants me to give out her hometown, but
yeah.
And then the other is Nora O'Connor, who lives in Evanston, and Nora goes out with all these bands. She sings background for Jacob Dylan, Nico Case, the New Pornographers, a bunch of other bands like indie rock band. another really kind of big famous one. And she's an Evanston mom, and so sometimes she'll just tell her husband, I'm going to be gone for a couple of weeks. And then she comes back, and so it's kind of it is kind of an interesting lifestyle doing that. You know, you're not the performer, but you are an essential part of a band's sound too. And that's why
100%.
they hold on to you.
Yeah.
They know that. Yeah.
Well, I don't want to take any more of your time. You guys, thank you so much for doing this, Peter, Mark. Appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
Go buy the book downstairs. Mark will go down and sign books if you'd like. And Angela from Little Bean Books in Antioch. If you haven't been to Antioch, Little Bean Books, it's a cool little bookstore, and we don't have enough of them anymore. So a plug for Angela.